Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary. I have questions really in two different areas. The first is the proposal of the President to use some of the TARP funding to encourage small banks, community banks, to lend to small businesses. I'd like to know what the status of that is and what conditions or measures can be put in place to make sure that the small banks don't simply hold on to the money. I've heard, we've all gotten unstoppable feedback from small businesses in our districts that institutions they've had long relationships with, where they have perfect credit history, won't lend to them. They are arguing that the regulators, the banks will tell them the regulators won't let them lend. I don't know whether that is a excuse the banks are using or whether regulators really are putting on that kind of pressure. I'm also hearing feedback, though, that banks, the small banks, are saying, hey, you know, if we get the money, we'll keep it, and we're not going to necessarily use it to lend. So in order to avoid some of the pitfalls that characterize the support for the big banks that didn't always turn around and lend it, what precautions have been put in place? And then the second question is on the jobs issue. This recovery so far looks different than prior recoveries. It's not been as robust, even though the GDP growth in the last quarter was encouraging. Still, the job numbers are sluggish, and I'm interested to know your both sense of why the jobs aren't bouncing back as quickly as in prior recessions, and what are the most significant things that we can do to stimulate that job growth?
Excellent questions. First, on small business lending. We're proposing really 4 separate things to help address this problem. One is we have a series of well-designed targeted tax measures that go directly to small businesses: expensing, depreciation, zero capital gains on new investments in small businesses, new jobs tax credit. The second is to expand substantially SBA's existing guarantee programs. A variety of specific proposals in the President's plan, and we think those will be very effective. Those are important, but they're not sufficient. We are encouraging the supervisors. They are independent of the Treasury, but we're encouraging them to try to make sure they are providing a more balanced amount of guidance to examiners across the country so that examiners don't overcorrect and contribute unnecessarily to a tightening of credit conditions that would hurt viable businesses. In addition to that, we propose, as you said, a $30 billion small business lending fund that would give capital to small community banks that commit to use that capital to expand lending. We've designed this in a way that to give pretty powerful incentives to lend the money out. So if you increase lending to small businesses above the levels, above a certain baseline, then we reduce the dividend you pay the Treasury over time. Now, our view is that's a pretty powerful package set of proposals. You can't be certain that small banks will take $1 of capital and increase lending, but if small banks who could otherwise raise capital in the normal market can't raise capital, don't have access to capital, then they will cut lending. And that has a pretty negative effect on business access to credit. So capital is a very effective way of helping mitigate this problem.
And on that last point, though, what baseline are you using to measure whether they increase lending? And also, do you buy what the banks are saying about the kind of regulatory straitjacket they're in, or do you think they're using that as a fall guy?
I think you said it right. I do think, think of it this way. A bank's been doing business with a customer for 30 years. The bank made a bunch of other decisions with a bunch of other clients in the real estate area that costed a lot of money, left it very exposed, not enough capital. It's going to have to cut back on assets and lending to survive. What do you say to your customer that's been a good customer for 30 years? It's easier to say that the supervisor making me do it than to explain that I made a bunch of judgments that got me too exposed to commercial real estate. So I think there's a lot going on. But on the other hand, in every recession, what happens is that there's a risk that examiners, after a period where, in hindsight, they look like they were too easy, tend to overcorrect. And so I think it's good that the leaders of our supervisors, bank supervisors across the country, and this is the FDIC, the Fed, the OCC, and the OTS, they need to make sure they're leaning against that tendency to overcorrect in a recession, because that can cause a lot of damage too. Just briefly on the job front.
Before you go, what's the baseline?
I'm sorry, the baseline. I believe, but I have to check and make sure I say this correctly. I think we state it as at the level in 2009 we've designed that in a way, we think that's sort of a realistic baseline. You can't, the pipes of the parts of this finance that are still clogged, you can't force money through those pipes. We can't force banks to lend without taking risks. The government ends up with too much loss and risk. But we think to design this in a way that would substantially increase the odds that we're really helping mitigate the small business credit problem where it remains. On the jobs front, you won't have jobs without growth. Growth has to come first. There's always a lag. But I think most economists across the country would say we're on the verge now of seeing a sustained level of positive job growth for the country as a whole. And I think the best story looking back of why unemployment increased so much and why job losses were so steep was just that you saw just shattering damage to business confidence across the country. People were just too scared to do anything. And they cut back just dramatically because of the fear that they'd faced a very long period of no demand for their products. And that's going to take some time to heal. But it's beginning to heal. As your colleague said, you're seeing the early signs now, hours increasing, temp employment increasing. And that should that's
one last short question, Mr. Chairman. Does this recovery look different to you? The GDP growth was greater than expected, but still smaller than in prior recoveries, and the commensurate job situation has improved. Why do you think this looks different than
I think in many ways growth came more quickly, stronger, and more broad-based than many people expected. In that sense, it's encouraging. But because this is a recession caused by a long period of excessive borrowing, a huge overinvestment in real estate, a huge increase in leverage in the financial sector, there was no way that recovery was not going to be dampened by those basic forces. So as households across the country save more, start to reduce their debt burdens, as the financial sector digs out of this terrible mess it was in, any recovery was going to face significant headwinds in that context. So we're seeing, I think, the necessary, inevitable consequence of a recession that is born in part of a very damaging financial real estate boom that was fed by excessive borrowing and lending.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.